11:41 a.m. Low Earth orbit, 412 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. At this altitude, there is no weather, no wind, no sound of any kind. There is only the absolute silence of the vacuum, the slow curve of the planet below, and the brilliant, unfiltered light of the sun striking every surface with a clarity that no atmosphere softens. At this altitude, the Earth rotates below you at a speed that makes the entire Pacific Ocean scroll past in under 20 minutes. At this altitude, a military satellite the size of a school bus carries sensors capable of reading a license plate from 400 kilometers above the ground, intercepts communications from a continent below, and provides the real-time positioning data that allows a Tomahawk missile to strike within 1 meter of its intended aim point. USA-336 was one of those satellites, a classified National Reconnaissance Office asset in a low Earth orbit that had been operational for 14 months. Her sensors providing continuous high-resolution imaging coverage of military facilities across China, North Korea, and the broader Indo-Pacific region. She was, in the precise language of the intelligence community, a Tier 1 collection asset, irreplaceable, extraordinarily expensive, and central to the operational picture that U.S. military commanders depended on for everything from targeting data to battle damage assessment. At 11:41 a.m. USA-336 ceased to transmit. In the Space Operations Center at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado, the watch officer registered the loss of signal within 4 seconds. Automated anomaly detection systems flagged the event within 6 seconds. By 11 seconds after signal loss, preliminary analysis had confirmed that the satellite had not experienced a mechanical failure or power system anomaly. The signature of its final telemetry transmission was consistent with a high-velocity impact. By 40 seconds, the Space Fence radar network had detected a rapidly expanding debris cloud at USA-336's orbital altitude and inclination. By 90 seconds, Space Force analysts had computed the trajectory of the impactor from the debris dispersion pattern and confirmed what the watch officer had already suspected. USA-336 had been destroyed by a Chinese direct ascent anti-satellite missile, the SC-19, China's operational kinetic kill anti-satellite weapon, a direct ascent interceptor launched from a mobile transporter erector launcher, had reached USA-336's orbital altitude on a precisely computed intercept trajectory and destroyed the satellite with a kinetic kill vehicle that struck at a closing velocity of over 7 kilometers per second. The collision had generated an estimated 3,000 pieces of trackable debris and tens of thousands of smaller fragments, all of them now in orbits that threatened every other asset at similar altitudes. It was the most destructive anti-satellite test in history. It was not a test. In Beijing, the Politburo Standing Committee had authorized the strike 48 hours earlier. At the conclusion of a 3-day deliberation that had consumed more internal political capital than any military decision since the Korean War, the trigger was a specific set of intelligence reporting from Chinese sources that assessed USA-336's collection was actively supporting U.S. operational planning for a potential contingency in the Taiwan Strait, that the satellite's imagery and signals intercepts were being integrated into targeting packages, that its data was flowing directly into the systems that would direct U.S. precision strikes against Chinese military infrastructure in the event of a conflict. The decision to destroy it was framed internally as a defensive measure, degrading American precision strike capability before it could be employed, demonstrating that U.S. military space assets were not invulnerable, and establishing the precedent that China would contest American dominance in what Beijing called the fourth battlefield. The Politburo Standing Committee had calculated that the United States would absorb the loss. Satellite destruction in peacetime was unprecedented, but not an act of war. Or so Beijing's legal team had argued. The United States would protest. It would impose sanctions. It would demand negotiations over a new framework for responsible behavior in outer space. It would not respond militarily, because responding militarily to the destruction of a satellite would be disproportionate, or so Beijing believed, and because the political cost of escalating a space incident into armed conflict would be too high for any American president to accept. They had made 5 catastrophic mistakes. First mistake: the SC-19 launch had been detected, tracked, and attributed within minutes. The space-based infrared system satellites that monitored Chinese territory for ballistic missile launches had registered the SC-19's motor signature at ignition. Space Fence radar had tracked it from launch through intercept. The entire engagement, from launch to impact, had been observed in real time by U.S. Space Force assets that China's planners had concluded were blind to the specific trajectory profile of a direct ascent ASAT launch from the mobile launcher's pre-surveyed firing position in Inner Mongolia. They were not blind. The attribution was unambiguous within 11 minutes of the impact. Before Beijing had composed its first internal assessment of the strike, the President of the United States had been briefed with full technical details and a trajectory reconstruction that left zero room for deniability. China could not claim an accident. It could not claim mistaken identity. The evidence was in the telemetry archives of a radar network that had watched every second of the engagement. Second mistake: destroying USA 336 was an act of war under existing U.S. national security policy. The 2022 National Space Policy and its classified annexes, updated following China's 2021 anti-satellite test, explicitly characterized the deliberate destruction of a U.S. national security space asset as an armed attack under the War Powers Resolution and as a casus belli, justifying the use of proportionate military force. The policy had been written precisely because the previous ambiguity over whether satellite destruction constituted an act of war had been assessed as a strategic vulnerability that invited exactly the kind of action China had just taken. There was no ambiguity left. The legal framework was clear. The authorization to respond was already in the policy. The president did not need to convene a special session or seek new authorities. He needed only to give the order. Third mistake: China's own space program was exquisitely vulnerable. The People's Liberation Army, Strategic Support Forces space infrastructure, the ground stations, the launch facilities, the satellite control centers, the telemetry tracking networks, was concentrated at a small number of known, fixed, pre-surveyed locations. The Xichang Satellite Launch Center in Sichuan Province, the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center in Inner Mongolia, the Wenchang Space Launch Site on Hainan Island, the Weinan Satellite Measurement and Control Center in Shanxi Province, the Xi'an Satellite Control Center. These facilities had been studied, mapped, and targeted by U.S. strike planners for years. Their targeting packages were current, validated, and preloaded. Destroying them would not merely degrade China's military space capability. It would set back China's entire space program, military and civil, by a decade. Fourth mistake: the SC-19 mobile launcher had not escaped. Following the launch, the Transporter Erector launcher vehicle had attempted to disperse to a pre-surveyed alternate hide site 60 kilometers from the launch point. Standard PLA procedure for mobile launcher operations, designed to prevent retaliatory strikes against the launcher after it had completed its mission. The procedure assumed that U.S. surveillance of the launcher's post-launch movement would be limited by cloud cover, by the time required to retask imaging assets, and by the general confusion of the immediate post-strike period. None of those assumptions were correct. A classified U.S. surveillance satellite in a separate orbit had maintained continuous coverage of the launch area from a different angle than the one the PLA's operational security planners had accounted for. The launcher vehicle had been tracked continuously from the moment it fired until it pulled into its alternate hide site. Its new position was in the targeting database within 22 minutes of the satellite's destruction. fifth mistake. China had no diplomatic exit. Previous Chinese ASAT tests conducted against their own defunct satellites had given Beijing practice in managing the international response to kinetic space weapons use. Each time, China had absorbed the condemnation, waited for the diplomatic cycle to exhaust itself, and emerged with its program intact and its capability demonstrated. The playbook was established, but there was a critical difference between shooting down your own satellite as a demonstration and deliberately destroying a U.S. national security asset in what Beijing would subsequently claim was a defensive act. The former was a provocative test. The latter was an attack on the United States military. The international community, the treaty allies, and the U.S. Congress drew a sharp and immediate distinction. The window for Beijing to offer de-escalatory gestures, an expression of regret, an offer of compensation, a proposal for negotiations closed in the first 2 hours as allied governments lined up to condemn the act. And the U.S. Congress passed a resolution authorizing the use of military force with a speed that had not been seen since the days immediately following September 11, 2001. What happened in the next 4 hours and 19 minutes restructured China's space program for the next decade. At 12:14 p.m., 33 minutes after USA 336's destruction, the President of the United States authorized the military response. The response was calibrated with precision that matched the strategic stakes. It targeted China's military space infrastructure, the assets that had supported, enabled, and would sustain the ASAT capability that had just been used against a U.S. military asset. It explicitly excluded civilian space assets and civilian infrastructure. It was proportionate, targeted, and designed to eliminate capability rather than maximize casualties. It was also within the domain of what it targeted, comprehensive and devastating. At 12:19 p.m., two B-21 Raider stealth bombers that had been airborne on a classified alert patrol over the Pacific were given their target packages and turned toward the Chinese coast. Their targets were the Xichang Satellite Launch Center, the primary PLA military launch facility, responsible for launching the majority of China's military reconnaissance and navigation satellites, and the Xichang Space Launch Site on Hainan Island, the newer facility that had been designated as the launch site for China's next generation of military space assets. Both facilities were hardened to varying degrees. Neither was hardened against the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator delivered by an aircraft with a radar cross-section below detection threshold. The B-21 is to the B-2 what the B-2 was to every aircraft that preceded it. It does not appear on radar. It appears on the ground after its weapons have already arrived. At 12:22 p.m., 4 Virginia-class submarines, USS Delaware, USS Vermont, USS Oregon, and USS Montana, that had been on alert patrol in the Western Pacific, received their Tomahawk firing orders simultaneously. The coordinated salvo was designed to achieve time-on-target sequencing across 4 separate target sets. 32 Tomahawks from USS Delaware targeted the Yukon Satellite Launch Center in Inner Mongolia. The launch complex, whose mobile launcher infrastructure had dispatched the SC-19 that destroyed USA 336, and whose facilities supported the continued development and deployment of China's ASAT program. 28 Tomahawks from USS Vermont targeted the Xichang Satellite Control Center, the operational hub from which China's military satellite constellation was commanded and from which any follow-on ASAT operations would be directed. 24 Tomahawks from USS Oregon targeted the Recon Satellite Measurement and Control Center, the tracking and telemetry facility, whose radar network provided the precise orbital data that made kinetic ASAT engagements possible. Without Weinan, China could not compute the intercept trajectories that SC-19 required. 20 Tomahawks from USS Montana targeted the SC-19 launcher vehicle at its alternate hide site in Inner Mongolia, the site that Chinese planners believed was undiscovered, and the support infrastructure of the ASAT program's operational battalion. 104 Tomahawks, 4 target complexes, all of them in the air within 8 minutes of the firing order. At 12:31 p.m., the U.S. Space Force activated a classified capability employed for the first time operationally. 2 on-orbit space maneuvering vehicles were commanded to approach and disable 2 Chinese military reconnaissance satellites that provided the targeting data for China's ASAT program. The disable protocol used focused electromagnetic pulse generation at close range, non-kinetic, generating no debris, and leaving the satellites physically intact but operationally blind. Both ceased functioning within 40 minutes. China's space-based military surveillance picture went dark across 2 critical orbital planes. At 1:07 p.m., the B-21 raiders released their weapons against the Xichang Satellite Launch Center. The facility occupied a river valley in the mountains of Sichuan province. Its geography had been chosen decades ago specifically for its natural concealment from overflying aircraft. Against an aircraft whose radar cross-section was effectively undetectable, the valley's walls provided no concealment at all. 6 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators impacted the facility in a sequenced strike, targeting the vehicle assembly building, the launch pad infrastructure, the propellant storage complex, and the underground facility housing the launch control systems. The Xichang complex, from which China had launched dozens of military satellites over 4 decades, absorbed structural damage that engineers would later assess required complete reconstruction rather than repair. The propellant storage complex detonated in a secondary explosion that collapsed the eastern wall of the vehicle assembly building. The launch pad was rendered non-functional. Xichang would not launch another rocket for years. 20 minutes later, the second B-21 struck Wenchang. The newer facility on Hainan Island had been built with greater hardening against conventional air attack. Against a GBU-57, released from an aircraft that no Chinese radar had detected, the additional hardening was academic. 4 weapons impacted the launch vehicle integration facility, the launch pad structure, the ground support equipment storage building, and the facility's primary communications infrastructure. Wenchang's 2 operational launch pads were both rendered non-functional. The integration facility, where China's most advanced rocket systems were assembled for launch, was destroyed. The Tomahawks began arriving over their targets at 1:34 p.m. Juquan absorbed its 32 Tomahawk salvo over a 14-minute impact window. The launch complex infrastructure that supported mobile ASAT launcher operations, the integration facilities, the fueling stations, the command posts, the transporter maintenance depot, was systematically destroyed. The SC-19 launcher vehicle itself, located at its alternate hide site by the surveillance satellite that had tracked it from launch, was struck by 4 Tomahawks in a terminal salvo. The vehicle was destroyed. Its crew, who had deployed to a crew shelter at the alternate hide site, following standard post-launch procedures, were killed when a Tomahawk impacted their shelter in a direct hit. Xi'an received its 28 Tomahawks across the satellite control center's multiple facilities: the main operations building, the backup control center, the uplink antenna farm, the communications switching facility, and the power generation plant. Post-strike assessment would confirm 11 of the 28 Tomahawks had achieved direct hits on hardened structures. The Xi'an Satellite Control Center, from which China commanded its entire military satellite constellation, went offline permanently. China's military satellite operators lost command link to their entire constellation within 47 minutes of the first Tomahawk impact. Hainan was struck simultaneously. The tracking and telemetry network, whose radar data had enabled the SC-19 intercept solution, and whose continued operation would enable any follow-on ASAT operations, was reduced to inoperable wreckage in a 9-minute Tomahawk sequence. 3 of the facility's 4 large tracking antennas were destroyed. The 4th was damaged beyond operational use. The computing infrastructure that processed telemetry data was struck by 2 Tomahawks with delayed action warheads that penetrated the facility's roof before detonating. Without Winan's tracking data, China could not compute an ASAT intercept trajectory to sub-kilometer accuracy. The kinetic ASAT capability had been blinded at its source. By 4 p.m., 4 hours and 19 minutes after the president authorized the response, the operational assessment was complete. USA 336. Destroyed. Irreplaceable. A loss that would require 18 months and $4 billion to partially replace with a successor asset. In retaliation, Xichang Satellite Launch Center. Destroyed. Requiring complete reconstruction estimated at 5 to 7 years. Wenchang Space Launch Site. Both launch pads destroyed. Facility non-operational. Juquan ASAT support infrastructure. Destroyed. SC-19 operational launcher destroyed. Xi'an Satellite Control Center. Destroyed. China's military satellite command capability offline. Winan tracking network destroyed. ASAT targeting capability eliminated. China's military satellite constellation. 2 critical reconnaissance satellites non-operationally disabled by on-orbit U.S. assets. SC-19 Program Operational Battalion Support Infrastructure. Destroyed. PLA Strategic Support. Force Space Systems Department personnel killed across all strikes. 217. U.S. casualties. 0. U.S. spacecraft further damaged or destroyed. 0. In Beijing, the Politburo Standing Committee that had authorized the SC-19 strike reconvened in a session that lasted 11 hours. The calculation that the United States would absorb the loss of USA 336 and respond through diplomatic and economic channels had proven to be the most catastrophically wrong strategic assessment in the history of the People's Republic. The space program that China had built over 4 decades, the launch infrastructure, the control centers, the tracking networks, had been reduced to rubble in 4 hours and 19 minutes by an adversary that had apparently been waiting, prepared, and pre-targeted for exactly this contingency. The debris cloud from USA 336's destruction was still spreading through low Earth orbit, threatening every other satellite at similar altitudes, including China's own remaining assets. The international condemnation was unanimous and sustained. China had destroyed 1 American satellite and received in return the obliteration of its space program's operational infrastructure, the disabling of 2 of its own military satellites, and permanent international condemnation for the debris hazard it had created. In the Space Operations Center at Peterson Space Force Base, the watch officer who had registered the loss of USA 336's signal at 11:41 a.m. was still at his console at 4 p.m. The debris tracking displays showed thousands of fragments in the orbits that USA 336 had occupied. It was a scar on the space environment that would persist for years, a reminder of what kinetic anti-satellite weapons do to the commons of outer space. The watch officer logged the operational status of the remaining U.S. military satellite constellation. All assets nominal, no further losses, and submitted his shift report. The work of Space Force continues, as it always does, quietly, precisely, in the silence 400 kilometers above where weather exists, watching everything, remembering everything, ready for everything. This is what happens when you destroy an American military satellite. You do not establish deterrence. You do not demonstrate resolve. You do not create the conditions for negotiation from strength. You trigger a pre-authorized, pre-planned, pre-targeted response that arrives within hours and targets everything that made your capability possible. The launch centers, the control stations, the tracking networks, the launcher vehicle that carried the weapon. You find that the United States has been watching your mobile launcher since it left its garrison, that the legal authorization for a military response was written into policy before you gave the firing order, and that B-21 bombers no radar can see have been airborne and targeted before your satellite debris has finished expanding into its cloud. You find that destroying one satellite costs you your space program, and you find that the debris field your kinetic weapon created, the cloud of fragments threatening every satellite in low Earth orbit, becomes the permanent testament to your miscalculation. Visible on tracking displays around the world for the next 30 years, space is not a sanctuary for aggression. The United States Space Force, the United States Navy, and the United States Air Force demonstrated that reality on this day. At 11:41 a.m., in the silence of low Earth orbit, and in the fire and precision of a response that reached from the Pacific to the mountains of Xichang, within 4 hours, the cosmos is vast and cold and indifferent, and 412 kilometers above the ground, in the expanding debris cloud where USA 336 used to be, the lesson was written in the only language that adversaries ultimately understand.